Salt Lake City Planning Commission. Today's date is Wednesday, April 24th, 2024. The Planning Commission consists of residents from each Salt Lake City district that are appointed in a manner providing balanced geographic, professional, neighborhood, and community interest representation. The Planning Commission reviews and acts on any changes to the city's general plans, small area plans, special studies, zoning ordinances, and zoning district maps. The commission also reviews and acts on planned unit developments, conditional uses, and certain subdivisions. Our goal is to provide a welcoming and safe environment for everyone. We ask those in attendance to adhere to a few ground rules. 1, silence or turn off your cell phones. 2, respect the person speaking and do not interrupt or do other things that could intimidate or deter others from exercising their right to be heard. Clapping, cheering, jeering, shouting, or other actions used to discourage people who have different opinions from participating will not be tolerated. People who attempt to diminish someone else's input may be removed from the room. 3, if you wish to speak, come to the microphone once the public hearing has been opened and state your name. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to comment. Your time cannot be combined with someone else's time. Everyone will get the same amount of time to speak so that we can ensure everyone is treated equally. If you are a representative of an officially registered, recognized organization and the item you wish to speak on is within the boundaries of your organization, you will be given 5 minutes. If it is outside of your boundaries, you will be given 2 minutes. 4, if you have a handout that you want the commission to see, you need to leave copies because they become part of the legal record. 5, when commenting, speak clearly, keep your comments on topic and brief. 6, questions asked during a public hearing will not be answered during the public hearing. Rather, the commission may ask the applicant or staff to answer questions after the public hearing is closed, or ask city staff to follow up with you at a later time. We will go ahead and get started here. The report of the chair has nothing to report, and the vice chair is not here this evening, so we will go to the report of the director.
Thank you. So the main thing I wanted to talk about tonight is some things that you've probably have heard about in the news, but the big thing is this downtown entertainment district. We're working on some code changes that have been discussed with the owners, Smith Entertainment Group, the owners of the Utah Jazz and now NHL team, in the D4 zone. So because the state law that authorized the whole sales tax thing and creation of these project areas has a deadline of September 1st to have the zoning in place, that's going to be an expedited process. You will be holding a public hearing on those changes at the May 22nd, I think is the date, the second meeting in May. And so we have to condense our public engagement period with that. Fortunately, the changes are fairly limited in scope just because just last year, the city adopted some pretty sweeping changes to our downtown zones that address a lot of the types of things that are going to be needed for that. So we're really looking at some building height change, some uses that are going to change from conditional to permitted, and then probably the bigger thing is a topic which you just addressed with the Salt Palace, but signs. So all of that information is going to be out, become publicly available this week, tomorrow or Friday, and then we'll go through the process and hopefully get everything in place so that at least the zoning isn't the barrier to something happening, but we'll see how that goes. I'm trying to think if the council, they have not taken, what did they just recently adopt? They adopted something. Oh yeah. Yeah, so the other big thing that's been in the news is demolition of a historic building that occurred without all permits. The city council, fortunately, and you know this because you saw this text amendment prior to that occurring, the city council adopted those changes that were recommended by the Planning Commission for increasing the fines for work without the certificate of appropriateness approval, and put that restriction on new development for 25 years for people who do that. They also added something to it that requires the approved certificate of appropriateness to be posted on a property and visible. So while the work's being done, so similar to like what happens with building permits, so people know at least that there's been some kind of an approval, and that's a burden that the applicant will do. We'll provide them a copy of the certificate of appropriateness that can easily be posted, but it's going to be up to them to post that while they're doing their activities.
Thank you. We will go ahead and move on to the open forum. If anyone from the Planning Commission has anything they'd like to bring up.
Chair Christensen, I would like to ask that in our Dropbox, when we have access to the files, that the ones from the previous meeting are still available to us until we can read the minutes and make sure that so I can go back and review that, like for at least for 2 weeks, like that.
Yeah.
If that's
So
possible.
I should also bring up something that's changing. We're going to move away from Dropbox starting in May. We're actually building a system with the recorder's office that's similar to what the council uses as far as document storage. And so all of our planning commission packets will be done, they'll still be web-based, but they'll be hosted through the city's website. So there's no more Dropbox needed. Everything that you see, the public will also see. And so it's just a more reliable way to access that information. And the other thing that it does is that it speeds the process up for when we transmit something to the city council. So it's pushing buttons instead of building these giant PDFs. So we'll give you more information on that, obviously, as it develops.
Mr. Chair, I also have a request that the planning staff, please, when you put a public comment into the Dropbox, please put the person's name with it.
Okay.
So comment number 4 from Pete doesn't really help at all. So I know we don't use mailing addresses or emails or phone numbers, but it really is reasonable to expect that a person would expect their public comment to have their name on it.
Well,
Oh, I have one more thing.
oh, go ahead.
Today I saw, maybe on Twitter, maybe from you, a report to City Council about collapsing residential zones and et cetera, et cetera. Is that going to come before us before it goes to City Council?
So right now, it's something the council specifically asked for. So they have that report's been transmitted to them. We're waiting for them to schedule a briefing. Basically what it does is it outlines a bunch of different options that they may have depending on whatever goals they decide to implement. So we will do a similar presentation to the commission so you know about what's in the report. And that'll be coming up at one of the not too distant future meetings.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go ahead and move on to the consent agenda. We have 2 items. One item, or the first item, is plan development modifications for Glendale Townhomes at approximately 1179 South Navajo Street. Case number PLN PCM 2021-00378. And we also have the approval of the meeting minutes from March 27th and also from April 10th. And the one planning item does require a public hearing, so we will go ahead and open the public hearing on that item. If there's anyone wishing to speak on the plan development at approximately 1179 South Navajo Street, go ahead and approach the microphone.
Commissioner Christensen, I would like to move that item from the consent agenda to the regular agenda. Is this an appropriate time to make that motion?
After we do the public
Okay.
hearing on it. It does not appear that we have anyone wishing to speak on it. Have we received any emails on it? we will go ahead and close the consent agenda or close the public hearing on the consent agenda. And now is a time to make a move, make a motion.
Okay, I have another item really quick. For the minutes for April 10th, I think that the minutes that include the motion that was approved for the Hoyt Place doesn't reflect the actual language that occurred in that meeting, so I'd like to make an amendment to that.
So, point of order, if we are going to entertain a motion to remove an item from the consent agenda, that should predate any motion to address the minutes that are still in the consent agenda.
Yeah. We
Okay.
we should do, yeah.
Well, now I'm back to making a motion to move the item from the consent agenda. Let's see. I'd like to move the item, the plan development modifications for Glendale Townhomes, from the consent agenda to the regular agenda.
A second?
Because I think we should discuss it.
I'll second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Burrows and a second from Commissioner Scheer. And this is a motion to remove item 1 from the consent agenda and place it on the regular agenda. Any discussion to the motion?
I think this kind of thing is appropriate when the planning commission feels that the plan development is actually changed substantially from what was approved. And so that is the reason why why I would want to do this, because I think it's more substantial.
Let's go ahead and take a vote. Commissioner Gale,
No.
Commissioner Tuttle,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
No.
Commissioner Scott. Yes. Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
and the chair will also vote yes. That motion passes 5-2. And we will move that to the start of the regular agenda.
Commissioner Christensen, Chair Christensen, I want to make a motion to change the minutes for April 10th for the regular agenda item number 1. It says, Commissioner Scheer stated, based on the information presented in discussion, I move the commission approve this plan development application as recommended by staff with the elimination, it should say, of the words porch design from the second condition. That's my motion. I went back and watched the video, and I think it does make a difference if we're saying the words porch design versus the thing porch design. So that's the way I remembered it and listened to it and felt like that's what we voted on.
I'll second the motion.
We have a motion from Commissioner Burrows and a second from Commissioner Tuttle. Any discussion to the motion? Let's go ahead and take a vote.
Point of order, are we voting on the approval of the minutes with of the consent agenda with the amendment?
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
With the amendment. So we're, the whole consent agenda plus with the amendment. Okay.
They're deciding right now.
If we do that, then I think we need to withdraw that motion.
I
Yeah.
feel like my
Let's-
motion was just to change
Let's
this.
do it as through. Yeah. Let's go ahead and take a vote just on the motion to amend the minutes from April 10th. Commissioner Scott. Okay. Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
Commissioner Shear.
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. That passes with 6 yeses and 1 abstention. And now we can entertain a motion to approve the minutes as amended from March 27th and April 10th.
I'll make a motion to approve those 2 meeting minutes. The whole consent agenda.
Yeah.
I make that motion.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
We have a motion to approve the consent agenda as amended from Commissioner Burrows and a second from Commissioner Tuttle. Any discussion to the motion? Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Scott.
Yes, but not for the 10th. I abstained because I wasn't there.
Gotcha. Commissioner Shear.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
Commissioner Barry.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale.
I abstained from March 27th. I wasn't present at that meeting, and yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That passes unanimously with 1 abstention on the 10th and 1 abstention on the 27th. We will go ahead and move on to the regular agenda with the one item first that we moved, which is plan development modifications for Glendale Townhomes at approximately 1179 South Navajo Street. Case number PLN PCM 2021-00378. And our planner is Eric Dems.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item is considered a major modification, which is required to come back to the Planning Commission. And so basically there's a few things taking place. They've proposed to increase the unit count from 53 to 74, doing that primarily through a reconfiguration of the unit types. It's still the same unit types that were offered, but just changing those up as to size and configuration. So they essentially put those additional units in the same basic footprints. And this is just due to changing market conditions. They felt, because if you see, this original request was from 2021, and it's come through to the Planning Commission and then went through an extension later. So this is the 3rd time it's been here in some format. In the rear of the property, there's a large 60-foot public utility easement, and under the original approval, it was anticipated that they could still have certain private amenities there, like a pickleball court, barbecue pits, playground. And since Public Utilities has investigated that further, and they will be need to access that potentially quite frequently, and so now they have said nothing can be there except for simple landscaping. They don't even want trees there due to that unique easement they have at the rear of the property. So they did say it'd be fine for surface stalls. So the applicant has proposed to increase the surface stalls in that area by 20. And related but not part of this request, they have submitted a subdivision plat that would allow each of these units to be sellable rather than just as one giant rental project. Staff's recommending approval with the condition that they remove 10 of those surface stalls and return them just a landscape open space and as an amenity for the residents. So this is the original site plan that was approved you can see at this, these amenities that were here, barbecue, playground, pickleball, things like that at the rear of the property. But the basic configuration of buildings, this is the new one. Again, the units are, squeezed. They're a little different configuration. They're still 2-bedroom, but they're just a different unit style. And then you can see in yellow the large easement area that would remove those private amenities. The facades largely stay the same, except for the fact that the configuration is changing, so doors and things like that might move a little bit, and window patterns. But other than that, the materials and the basics of the building are remaining the same. Staff felt that this was still in the spirit of the original proposal, with meeting the plan development objectives for providing a housing type not typically found in the area, still met the zoning requirements, and felt that although these changes were taking place, they still were within the context of the original plan development approval. So I can leave it right there. If there's additional questions, I don't believe the applicant was able to make it tonight, but I'm happy to answer questions.
So where do you want the 10 parking spaces to come out of?
Yeah, these surface stalls,
There's,
yeah, potentially, central or whatever. It really doesn't matter. I just saw this as potentially additional green space. Kids can kick a soccer ball, things like that. That was, it talks about in the plan development and providing something better than what could be allowed. And I just felt that providing all this additional parking, so they'll just in the units themselves, they easily meet their parking requirements.
Because they've squeezed it up, are they having fewer parking spaces in the unit?
No.
Does each unit still have 1 or
Yeah.
2 parking spaces?
Yeah, they still are able to provide all the parking within the
All
units.
the parking is not answering the question.
All-
They have 1 or 2 spaces in each unit.
Yeah, some of them are squeezed to 1 if they're they all, I believe all of them are two stalls still, actually.
Okay, but we don't,
Yeah, but they meet, the requirement is, I believe, 1 or 1 point, anyways, I don't have it right in front of me with the staff report. You've got that in there. But they do meet all the parking for each unit. These surface stalls are not necessary to meet the code, any of them.
okay. It says in the zoning information that there's 76 stalls provided in garages. There's how many units?
74.
So there's only 1 parking space per unit. At the most.
I can double check.
Is that right? I mean, I'm just looking.
Yeah, the prior approval that's included in the staff report shows a total of 123 parking stalls, 105 in garages, 18 on the surface,
So
and
quite a
that
bit
was
fewer.
57 units.
Almost 2 parking spaces. Well, that's what I'm saying. When you squeeze the footprint of the unit, you're also squeezing it from a 2-car garage to a 1-car garage and et cetera. So it's actually quite different in terms of providing on-site parking than the original proposal. Not that, they don't meet the minimums. Of course, they have to meet the minimums. But in terms of what they've done here, it's really, I think, a very different kind of project. I'm happy to hear that they might be doing for sale product, but this was a very controversial project to begin with, as I recall, and I'm really unhappy with not having any amenities left in the project. And now not only are there no amenities, there's also a lot less parking on site. So I don't know that we can squeeze 10 more out of these guys in terms of parking, when they don't already have enough parking. I mean, they're already providing quite a lot less than the neighborhood was told, than the neighborhood is expecting. Not that the neighborhood is part of the law, but I do think if we're going to make a recommendation, I'm not sure which is better, more parking or more open space. I ask you.
I have a question about that they have to, for plan development, they have to meet one of the objectives, right? One of the objectives. So the objectives that were determined to being met before was providing a type of housing that wasn't available in this neighborhood, like live-work units. Are these still large enough to be live-work units?
Yeah, so the ones along Glendale Drive still have that option.
Have those units changed in this
Yeah.
this version? Are they smaller than they were last time we saw them?
Yeah, most all the units are a reduced footprint per unit.
Do you feel like they're big enough or to still qualify as a live-work unit in actuality and not just in?
So I think there's two parts. One, a live-work unit, obviously in this context, I mean, as evidenced by failed businesses in the area, failed grocery store, you know, this is not a high commercial area. It's very much in the center of a neighborhood. It is not something that you know, retail or something like that would do. Commercial would do typically very well, but it does opt for something that somebody could do, you know, music lessons or salon or something or other. As any other live-work unit space, it's not going to be typically something seen primarily as commercial. But the unit types, I think, go beyond that. That there is not, you know, these townhome style units available in the area. It's almost entirely single-family homes. There's a few regular apartments, but almost all of it is a single-family home with a yard to be maintained, and this is a product that's not found in that area.
The fact that they're row houses, that they're attached multifamily instead of being single-family homes?
No, because of the subdivision plat, they're still single-family. Each one of these can be
Right.
purchased
But this
individually.
type of being, to have a shared wall is not available otherwise in the neighborhood? Because that was like the justification for why they even
Right.
qualify as a planned development, right?
Correct.
So I just wonder if like changing it to make them really small, and do they count as live-work units? Do they have to have like a separate entrance, like a business entrance to kind of count as that? Like, in what way are they different than the other places that are available in that neighborhood besides having a shared wall? Maybe that's it.
Again, so you've got a product that you don't have a yard that would necessarily need to be maintained, but then also, yeah, they do have an entrance from Glendale Drive that the public could access, and that's, you know, the way they're divided inside. It's still a live-work unit that they could approach that space without being in someone's living room.
How's the mix changing from like 2-bedroom to studio? Are they changing that way, or just every unit is smaller?
They're still 2-bedroom, they're just smaller.
Every unit's 2-bedroom?
Yeah.
And was the original justification for the plan development like the improved product? That's the requirement for plan
Well,
development,
so,
isn't it?
I mean, the original plan development was because of, you had units that were not, buildings that were not on a public street. So this is a better product in that if you did that, you result in a few narrow skinny lots with, you didn't have the ability to create this type of product. Had every building had to front on a public street, it would have been, you know, a pretty considerable waste of land in this zone.
Mr. Chair, can I make a recommendation? Considering that the applicant isn't here and a lot of these questions are questions that really should be answered by the applicant and not planning staff, it really isn't the planning staff's role to defend or explain someone's proposal. My suggestion is that the commission table this to a future date when the applicant can attend to answer the questions you have.
Thank you.
I'll make that motion.
Can we keep the public hearing open? I mean, I know we already closed it.
You've already closed it because it was part of the
Yeah,
consent.
but we weren't
you
able
can
to even
open.
move
you-
it to, we weren't even able to move it to the regular agenda until we had the public hearing.
Yeah, you can, as part of your motion, open a public hearing on the matter at a later date too.
I'm in favor of maybe of doing that so that the applicant can answer some of those questions, but I'd also like to make sure that you feel like it still meets the plan development, the requirement, the objectives that have to be met, without those amenities. Because I know that that was a big part of the conversation when we were talking before, like, how does it fit in this neighborhood and that kind of stuff. We talked about it before, and this does seem like a pretty big change from what we talked about and saw before. So I just want that to think about it, and so I can see it. So I'll make a motion to table this.
Richard already did.
Oh, you did. Did you? I'm sorry, friendly amendment. Can we open the public hearing? Great. I'll second it then.
Yes.
Well,
He hasn't made the motion yet, he just said he's willing to, but now Commissioner Tuttle can do that.
I'll make a motion that we table this item and include the language from Commissioner Burrows in the motion.
And can we amend that to open a public hearing at the time we hear it again?
Yes.
Thank you.
should I second that? I'll do it.
Yes. We have a motion to table from Commissioner Tuttle and a second from Commissioner Burrows. Any discussion to the motion? Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
No.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
Commissioner Shear,
Yes.
and the chair will also vote yes. That passes 6-1 and is tabled for a future meeting. We will go ahead and move to the next item, which is rezone at approximately 1860 South State Street. Case number PLN PCM 2024-00033. And our planner is Trevor Ovenden.
Good evening. All right, there we go. All righty. So this is a zoning map amendment request at 1816 South State Street. The applicant is requesting to rezone the property from BP Business Park to CC Commercial Corridor to allow the building at this site to be leased for commercial uses that are not currently allowed in the BP zoning designation. So the BP zone allows these uses when they are part of a business park, but not as standalone uses. So the subject property is highlighted on the right, and as you can see, the property is immediately north of the OC Tanner Campus Business Park, but it is not part of the campus. So here are a few excerpts of zoning maps over the years, just showing how zoning has changed in the area. So in 1994, this area was zoned C3, General Business Activity, and it's not a zone that we have anymore. And then when the city was rezoned in 1995, this entire block was zoned BP, including the subject property, even though it was not part of the OC Tanner campus. And then shortly after the 1995 rezone, the properties immediately north of the site were rezoned to CC, and there weren't a ton of records about this, but what I could find said that the rezone of those properties to the north along Coatesville was because the BP zoning designation would have made the commercial uses at these properties non-conforming, which is interesting because the subject property was used for commercial use at that time. So when it was rezoned to BP, that use became non-conforming. So here are just a few site and vicinity photos. The subject property consists of a 5,756 square foot single-story commercial building that was constructed in 1948. The building includes office and warehouse space, is currently being used as a vocational school for tattooing and piercing. 13 off-street parking spaces are provided to the rear of the building. So what would the CC zone change? So I'm just going to talk about uses. Obviously, there's way more uses than this. I'm just including this to highlight that restaurants and retail businesses are permitted by right in CC, but only allowed in BP as part of a business park development with a few more rules that kick in. And then as far as development regulations go, so the applicant doesn't intend to redevelop the site, but if the site were to redevelop, these are the regulations it would be subject to. So the current zone allows buildings up to 60 feet in height, while the requested CC zone only allows buildings up to 45 feet tall with design review approval from the Planning Commission. The requested CZ zone also requires smaller setbacks than the current BP zone, so a 15-foot front yard, 10-foot rear yard, and no side yard setback requirement compared to a 30-foot front yard, 20-foot rear yard, and 20-foot side yard requirement. And both zones require about the same amount of off-street parking. Okay, so the Central Community Master Plan is the neighborhood plan applicable to this site, which designates the future land use of this property as community commercial, which is intended to provide for the close integration of moderately sized commercial areas with adjacent residential neighborhoods. This description is consistent with the purpose of the requested CC zoning designation, which is to provide for, among other things, commercial development while promoting compatibility with adjacent neighborhoods. In addition to being supported by the relevant future land use map, this request is also supported by several goals in the plan that are intended to encourage repurposing commercial buildings for new commercial uses when appropriate. The proposed zoning map amendment is generally consistent with the standards for general amendments. This request is supported by several goals listed in the Central Community Master Plan, as well as the plan's future land use map. Based on these findings, planning staff recommends that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to the City Council for the proposed zoning map amendment. And that is it for my presentation.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and have the applicant come forward.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, and Trevor did such a good job. I don't feel like there's too much more to say.
Double check to make sure the microphone's
Oh,
on.
the micro,
Okay,
can you hear me
there
now?
we go.
Okay.
And state your name for the record, too.
Tiffany Price, I'm the owner of the property. I do not plan on developing it. It's a great commercial use there. The business park just limits it for the uses that we need in the neighborhood. And so retail service uses and those things, but I think it would be of community value, and everything else around there is zoned community commercial.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? We will go ahead and open up the public hearing on this item. So if there's anyone from the public who would like to speak on it, go ahead and approach the microphone. It does not look like anyone wishes to speak. Have we received any emails on this?
We have not.
We will go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission.
Mr. Chair, I'm ready to make a motion. Based on the information presented in discussion for PLN PCM 2024-00033, I move that the commission recommend to the City Council approve this proposal for a zoning map amendment based on staff's recommendation.
I'll second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Berry and a second from Commissioner Gale. Any discussion to the motion? Let's take a vote. Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle,
Yes.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Berry,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That passes unanimously and goes off to the city council.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor.
Our next item is monument signs in manufacturing districts text amendment, case number PLN PCM 2023-00970. And our planner is Andy Hoka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tonight I'll be presenting to you a request to amend the zoning text with regards to monument signs in manufacturing districts. It's a private petition initiated by Yesco Sign Company to amend the ordinance related to monument signs in manufacturing districts. The proposal would allow one monument sign for every 250 feet of street frontage, with each sign separated by at least 150 feet. Currently, we only allow one monument sign per street frontage, regardless of the frontage. Partially, this is intended to address current trends in development towards larger lots in manufacturing districts with much longer street frontages. The map on the screen is the M1 and M2 zoning districts, so these are all the manufacturing properties that would be affected by this proposal. To be clear, currently, I just want to go over monument signs, make sure we're understanding what we're looking at. It's specific to monument signs, so this proposal wouldn't affect other sign types like pole signs or billboards or anything else. These are just freestanding signs whose sign face extend to the ground or to a base. None of the setback, height, or area provisions in the code are proposed to be amended. It's only the number of signs permitted that we're discussing tonight. What's being proposed is that we add new language to the table that's in the zoning ordinance for signs in manufacturing districts that states one per each 250 linear feet of street frontage. Each sign shall be separated by at least 150 feet. So when we were reviewing this request, as always, the first step was to review city goals and policies to make sure it complies. Generally speaking, Plan Salt Lake supports the growth of industrial areas, but in a way that fits in with the context, enhances the public realm. The urban design element is another planning document that we have that had some pretty specific information about signs. It specifically said signage throughout commercial industrial areas need not be overpowering, and that we should provide ample opportunities for business to advertise products and service without having a detrimental effect on the community. So we took that direction, wanted to make sure that we're supporting business growth, but doing it in a way that doesn't have any negative impacts on the community. We also looked at neighboring cities to see what is common best practices for these types of signs in similar contexts. West Valley allows one monument sign per 200 feet of frontage with signs separated by 100 feet. So as a reminder, we're looking at one per 250 feet with separation of 150 feet. And then Magna, similar but a little bit higher, one sign per 300 feet of frontage. South Salt Lake has a different way of calculating based on street frontage and total area of the signs, but they do allow multiple monument signs in these similar manufacturing type zones. And then the picture on the screen is an existing property. This is in the International Center west of the airport. These are two separate properties with separate signs, so it's not exactly the same, but it's just a good example of two monument signs that are in the M1 district that are about 150 feet apart. So just to give you a little visual of what to expect if this proposal goes through. But with that, we felt that what was being proposed was consistent with the guidance from the city's policy documents, consistent with best practices in neighboring cities. And so we are recommending that you recommend the City Council approve the text amendment. That's all I have for you. The applicant has a representative here that's also available to answer questions.
Thanks. Let's go ahead and have the applicant come forward. And go ahead and state your name for the record.
Eric Cheney, representing Yesco. Thank you for your time.
And go ahead and give us any additional information that,
That pretty much summed it up. Just what we're running into is these large manufacturing projects have multiple entrances, truck access, so a lot of these semis are getting lost. A lot of these utility trucks that are coming in and out of these big manufacturing buildings have no idea where to go. And so they've been asking us to put up, monument signs, and we think it's well within reason because of such a large frontage. It's 500 plus feet. And so they just want to be able to brand, but also direct traffic appropriately.
thanks. Any questions from the commission?
I do, 1 second.
Yeah, I've got one. So, would these signs only be for directing that kind of traffic? Like, is it purely for that, or will they be for just like what the business is, if that makes sense? Are they like trucks turn in here, or is it,
Great question. It would probably be on a case-by-case basis, depending on this code change. But in this specific case, it's for both. It's truck access, wayfinding, also with monument branding. So truck drivers coming in and out know where to go, and also anybody that's coming to just the building generally has the name of the brand, and they know that they're at the right building.
So I have a couple questions for staff. Andy, do we limit the number of entrances per property in these?
We do, and I can pull that up.
I think I'd like to know if we limit the number of entrances per the property, but also if we require those entrances to be so many feet apart, right? So if we don't, do you know what I'm saying? I'd like to know that, and then I want to know too, Andy, if I guess my question is one of like, do we need a lot of multiple signs if it's like the same building, depending on how long the property is? So do we divide the properties based on like the size of the building, and we consider that like one property? Because in the picture description you gave, the example you gave, we have two properties, two different uses. So my question is is it one way to think about attacking this per the building, like it's the same use? And so do we really need something that says every has separated by 150 feet, or do we limit like, okay, in this building you could have this many entrances, that's how many signs you can have? It makes sense to me if we have two different buildings, two different uses. Obviously, like in the example photo, that seems fine. But I'm just curious, if we have one building on a piece of property that's really large, which we can have in an M1 zone, is this the right approach to it? Or can we just have like way too many signs for this one building? Do we need that many? And I don't know the answer to that, but I kind of want to address maybe the way to think about it. But I'd like to know the entrances thing, because I think that will help do that, direct
Sure.
that thinking.
And
So,
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on that. And for those that were at, I think it might have been the last planning commission meeting, or the one before, where the commission discussed some changes to the driveway standards and tabled that to bring it back for more things. There is the intent in our code when we updated the parking chapters was to better regulate driveways. Unfortunately, there was a provision that was applied to all zones that said the maximum width of all combined driveways was like 50 feet. That does not work in these big, large footprint buildings with big, huge trucks. And so that was part of that proposal. So we're looking at changing that, but for these zones, we're not necessarily changing it for other zones. But the idea is that we do want to somewhat limit it. One thing that we historically have found in the industrial areas is that it's kind of self-limiting. because the driveways are typically aligned in between the buildings, where the semis and things would be coming in to access the loading bays and everything else. And so it's a little different environment than what many of us are used to in a more urban setting.
And one thing maybe just to add on to that is that we did consider a couple different options of how we might regulate this. One of those was the entrances, because I agree with you, that just makes sense. That's logically where people are coming and going from the property. That makes sense to direct people that way. But we were concerned that tying it to something that's regulated elsewhere in the code sometimes gets messy, especially if maybe the driveways subsequently get amended and then that interacts with the sign code. And so we felt it was probably cleaner to just have a set standard. But that was something that we considered, and I think it's a good point.
I would think, you know, to Commissioner Berry's point, I actually think it's not so much that one depends on the other, but they're consistent with each other. In other words, if the driveways could be 200 feet apart and the signs have to be 250 feet apart, and then you've got this sort of little rhythm going on that's kind of, yeah. So did we land on, we did sort of, so just as a question for Nick, did we land on, did you guys make a recommendation about the distance between driveways or just the width of the driveways?
I think that's something that we didn't include that in the original proposal, and I think that's one of the reasons why you asked us to bring something back.
Okay.
To deal with spacing.
Because I have no objection to this, but I do think it would be good to be consistent, so you're not like at 325 feet here and 375 feet there. I mean, maybe this is flexible enough that it'll be okay.
Yeah.
Do the current rules have kind of, they can be only this close to the edge of your property?
For driveways?
No,
or
for
the
signs.
I think it would, there's the 5-foot setback, which was just from any property line, and then any clear view standards would apply, but I don't know that there are any other regulations that would affect how close to the side you could get.
Before we forget, let's go ahead and open up the public hearing. Anyone wishing to give public comment on this item, go ahead and approach the microphone. Seeing no one, have we received any emails?
We have not.
We will go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission.
Okay, so now that we're in discussion period, one of the things that I guess I'm concerned about is that we end up having signs every 250 feet because we can. And I don't want to see that happen. So I appreciate your comments about not tying it to the number of entrances. So maybe that's not the perfect approach. But that's my concern, is that we just end up with a sign every 250 feet. I want to meet the needs of, you know, the logistics of like, hey, truck center here, hey guys, but I'm worried about that happening per use. So in a way, I wonder if we can't tackle this in a way that like, oh, you can have a sign per your building use. And then if you have additional entrances, you can have a sign there. I don't know the answer. So some of it's still a question, but as it stands now, that's my worry, and I don't know if we can alleviate that worry if you have, you know, something to help me feel like that's not going to happen.
Well, I think one thing that I can say, and it goes back to what Nick said about these being somewhat self-regulating, when we were looking at other cities, looking at somewhere like, say, for instance, West Valley, that doesn't have a maximum limit, there's no cutoff, it's one sign per 200. We just briefly looked around on the maps, but didn't really see any evidence that that was the case. I think these monument signs are typically pretty large, and you can maybe speak to expense, but I don't see that trend. And
Why do you think they're self-regulating? Just because of cost?
yeah, there's not, I think, much benefit to just having a whole ton in a row. But that's probably also something better that the applicant might be able to help with.
Just from what I've seen, it seems like having this distance, because it just doesn't, there's not a lot of properties out there that have this frontage. So I understand what you're saying. That totally makes sense, because you don't want to be in a city where there's a monument corner.
I just want signs on every corner.
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
That's a really good point you just brought up. Do we know how, off the top of your head, right? In these M1 zones, do you know like the maximum length? Like, what's the largest building that's out there? And what are the smallest buildings?
It's north of 1 million square feet. So if you do the math on that, those are buildings that the footprint is often over 200 acres.
Yeah, so they could have how many signs?
They usually don't put a ton of signs out, because they usually take the Post Cereal Distribution Center. Their signs are on their building. They might have 1 or 2 monument signs at their entrances that are 1,800 feet apart. But that's typically the case with monument signs in industrial areas, is that they're not, their purpose is far different than a lot of retail or restaurant where they really want to get people to see them, right? It's mainly, there's people who are specifically looking for that business, and
I don't want monument signs to become our billboards, where they're just everywhere.
Are monument signs, could they become like a billboard where you have to build an apartment building around it one day? Or they have to be owned by, like, they can't be.
They have to advertise the business that's on the property.
I'm ready to make a motion.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I have one quick question. Can you explain the difference between the number of signs permitted per sign type and limit on combined number of signs, since those are the...
Right, yes. So the monument signs and pole signs were previously grouped together on this table, and they had that combined number between the two, monument and pole signs. Planning Commission recently reviewed an amendment related to projecting signs, which made some organizational changes to the tables. So the pole signs were, based on that amendment, moved elsewhere. So they are no longer combined in this table based on your recommendation recently, but that column still exists in the table. So we just wanted to be consistent. We included the same language in.
Okay. So it used to be that there were 2 kinds of signs that were grouped, and that's no longer the case, but that's what it's talking about. It's not saying okay. I was wondering if it meant that this is the number of signs, and then limit on combined number of signs was but 3 maximum kind of thing for a property. So that makes sense.
No, yep, that's right.
Does it make sense to consider the monument sign at the same time we figure out the driveways? Do you like thinking about those 2 things together?
I'm prepared to make a motion. Based on the information presented and discussion, I move the commission recommend that the city council approve this zoning text amendment proposal.
I'll second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Gale and a second from Commissioner Scheer. Any discussion to the motion? Let's take a vote. Commissioner Barry.
No.
Commissioner Scott.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale.
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
No.
Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That motion passes 5-2. and moves on to the city council. Thanks. That concludes our regular agenda, and we now have a briefing on commercial and mixed-use zoning district consolidation by our planning director, Nick Norris.
All right. I'm going to start by introducing some of the reasons behind what we're doing with this proposal, and we're going to get into it a little into the presentation. But the big picture is that as we've been going through a bunch of text amendments and things like that, particularly city initiatives, and I think you all probably have experienced this, it's become very, very complicated to make changes fit without having unintended consequences. And so given that our current workload in the division is changing pretty dramatically because of a decline in development applications, we had the capacity to really take a look at our zoning districts and figure out if there was a way that we could help improve, for many reasons, just our zoning structure in the city. And so that's the origins of this. This was something that we presented to Mayor Mendenhall, who made it one of her goals for this calendar year. And so this is your introduction to this project. So we're going to go over the goal tonight. We're not really going to get into a lot of the meat of changes. We're going to talk about our work plan and how we're going to go about doing this and the role of the Planning Commission and things like that. So those are what we're going to touch on, and maybe some things that you can think about as I'm going through this are, what outcomes do you want to see generated from this project? And we want some input on the community engagement. We're going to actually setting up meetings right now with community leaders, not just community councils, but business leaders and things like that. Not to get their input on the proposal yet, but to help shape the engagement process, because this will be the single largest code change that the city's done in almost 30 years. So by the time it's been adopted, it probably will be 30 years. And then just the overall scope of our project, and then how to best utilize commission time, especially if we get to situations where agenda lengths are large, and how do we fit everything in? Because as we show you everything that's changing in here, it could feel overwhelming. So some of the goals that we have with this is really aligning our zoning with our land use policies. We want to be able to implement our plans and make it easier to do so. So one of the mottos that I have, and I think I share this quite often with our staff, is that if we want it, make it easy. And that applies to zoning as well. And so we're hoping to do that. We also want to address a lot of inconsistencies with our land use regulations. And when I say inconsistencies, sometimes it's language that's used to describe in two different zones to describe the same thing, and it's different. And that leads to confusion for everybody who has to use the code, whether it's the city to administer it, architects who have to design to it, developers who are trying to make a project determine if it's feasible. That helps us improve and be more consistent about how we apply our code. We also want to reduce redundancies. So one thing that we'll point out as we go through this process over the next several months is how many of our zoning districts are very, very similar to each other with just relatively small differences. Sometimes it's 5 feet of building height. Sometimes it's a 15-foot front setback instead of a 10-foot setback. Other zones, it's 30 feet of building height compared to 28. And so looking at those types of things and really asking the question if all of those different districts are really necessary to achieve our goals. We already talked a little bit about this, but reducing conflicting regulations. And one thing that we found as we've been going through and drafting all of these changes, everybody's favorite topic lately, signs, has all kinds of conflicting regulations in there. And I think we're cutting something like 20 pages from our sign code of just conflicting regulations. So part of the big project. So let's talk a little bit about the work plan. The work plan includes 7 different sections. We're not going to repeat the goals, but we're going to talk about these other parts, the guiding principles, an overview of our summary. We're not going to get into the list of actions because it's a more detailed list of the summary of proposal, our timeline, our resource needs, and then things that are risks to the project, not risks to outcomes, but really risks to impact our timeline or the resource needs or things like that. So when we started this process, we came up with a couple of guiding principles that we wanted to make sure that we're including, and one is to maintain existing property rights as much as possible. We didn't want to create a situation where we were where one current zone allows a building height of 50 feet and reducing that to 35. We wanted to make sure that we are erring on the side of the property right, and instead of going the other way. We want to, as best we can, reduce non-conforming uses and minimize creating new non-complying buildings. So we don't want to suddenly add a setback where one doesn't exist, or make something larger where it negatively impacts something that's existing. We want to keep the regulations that work. We have a really good idea of what those are, and focus on those regulations that really don't work. So for example, in the CB zone, there's some additional design review standards that have worked really well in regulating building scale. And so we want to make sure that even though the CB zone is going to be replaced, that those types of things are maintained. And then we really want to focus on promoting mixed use development. So we don't want to create barriers to certain types of uses, especially when they're achieving that big goal of being mixed use, promoting more neighborhood walkability. So this is the summary of how it stands right now. This is still subject to change, but this is where we have the direction we have been going in drafting things. So some of these zones are already existing, and you as a commission have reviewed these, but it's a series of 6 different mixed use zones. The long-term intent is for this to expand to also include the downtown zones, the GMU zones, and other things that right now we aren't including because of the recently adopted changes to those. And then the middle column are all of the zoning districts that are going to be combined. So when you look through that, you start seeing, oh, there's 25 plus zoning districts there. And that's true. So some of the big ones that are going away, I see a typo on that bottom line, but for example, all the commercial zones are changing. Everything from the small SNB, where there's a handful of properties in the city that are zoned that, all the way up to the general commercial zone, and everything in between. And to accomplish this, we really only need to create 2 new zones. Part of that is because we've been focused on creating these form-based zones that really transition really well to some of these other zones. And that was intentional from going back several years, and we're finally at the point where we feel like we can make this work. So, and it's those low-end zones, those MU2 and MU3 zones. So combining those RB, CN, and SNB zones, and then the CB and the RMU35 zone. The FBUN2 zone you're familiar with, it's the one in Central Ninth. It's being used for both the MU5 and the MU6, and the reason for that is because within that UN2 zone, there's 2 different height requirements based on location. And so everything is pretty much the same except for the height. And so that allows us to use that for the MU6. Those zones that are listed, existing districts in the MU6, all have maximum heights around 60 feet. Some are 50, some are 60, but no, actually I think they're all 60. And so that's why we're able to do that. The MU8 zone is something that you've already reviewed, and the city council is starting the adoption process on that. That's around the ballpark. It's intended to replace a lot of the core TSA zone areas, and you can see the other zones as well. One of the more unique things that we're adding here is the RMF 75 zone. So these are usually, when you see a tall apartment building in the city that's older, it's usually RMF 75. And over the years, we've had a number of property owners come in, homeowners associations, et cetera, in these buildings who have some common space on the ground floor that they want to convert. Usually it's to a medical office. But because there's zoned RMF 75, those uses aren't allowed. And so most of the RMFs, there's virtually zero new development potential in the RMF 75 zone because of what's already there. And so this would, by moving this into that zone, it allows for some of those ground floor spaces to be commercial in nature. And then the MU11 zone is a zone that some of you probably didn't see because it went through the Planning Commission 4 or 5 years ago. And then stalled at the city council because the intent was to first apply it to the fleet block, and it got caught up in a lot of different externalities. But that was adopted in December finally, and so now it's on the books, and so we can use that to address some of these taller zones. That should say FB UN11, not RB UN11, but the CG zone, which is mostly along 300 West. And then the most intense TSA zone, and then the Sugar House Business District. So here's all the different chapters that are going to be deleted. I don't need to read each one of these, but I wanted to show it because it makes a significant impact in the total number of regulations we have in our code. But every single one of these zoning districts is going to be removed from the code. So please note on 21A26, that's the commercial zone. So there's all of those zones are going to go away. We're also going to replace the existing form-based zones with these new MU zones. They'll essentially be the same. One thing that we are looking at, particularly with the FBUN2, you may recall that as part of the downtown project, the Planning Commission adopted some changes to that. One of the things that you adopted were increased side yard setbacks, and one of the things that we're finding is that on narrower lots, because there are a lot of narrow lots that are zoned FBUN2, those setbacks are negatively impacting those properties. They're occupying sometimes almost 40 or 50% of the lot width. And so we may look at some changes like that as part of this proposal. We're also getting rid of a number of transitional or overlay districts that would no longer be relevant. Many of you probably don't know what this transitional overlay district is, but this is a district that allows certain light industrial uses in residential zones, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Most of it actually was zoned and placed in the Central Ninth neighborhood. When we rezoned that went away, and so now there's just some small little pieces scattered throughout that we're eliminate. The South State Street overlay, which adds some walkability requirements to a bunch of the zones along State Street, goes away because all of those zones are going to be replaced and include those same kinds of standards. And then, so on this downtown Main Street core overlay, even though it's not zones that we're touching, it actually doesn't include any regulations. It basically just says the uses allowed shall be the same as in the land use tables. And so I think it used to include provisions that were added to particularly the D1 zone, but for whatever reason, this was never taken out. So this is a list of all of the chapters in our code that will be changing, and the status. The status is drafting the changes. So I'm not going to list all of these. The first maybe 7 or 8 on there are all dealing with creating that MU chapter, which the MU8 zone actually establishes. You may recall that created a whole new chapter in our code, and it was designed and set up to accommodate plugging those existing zones into that chapter. So that as soon as the council adopts that, that will be in place. But you'll start seeing a lot of these other zoning or chapters in the zoning code. 21A 22 is just a list of all the zoning districts, so obviously that has to be updated. Most of these changes are just changing the references. They may reference the CC zone. That'll be updated to whatever that new zone is. And that's the same for all of these most of these that are listed here. And then we get into some of the other zones. So these first three are other places in our code of ordinances that reference zoning districts. So we have to change those too. They don't really, I'm not even quite sure what enhanced services means, but it references this, like the Sugar House Business District and some other zones. The news racks identifies zones where people can place news racks within the right of way. Street artists, where street artists can perform. We're going to be updating the parking chapter because right now, as you may know, the parking contexts are all zoning district based. All of those are changing. I'm going to get into this a little bit, so I'm not going to get into it any more than that right now, but you'll see this is one that's still further behind in the drafting simply because of the complexity of it. Similar with signs. I mentioned earlier that we're deleting something like 30 pages of our sign code by doing this. The landscaping chapter, which was just recently adopted, there's only 3 or 4 little changes in there, and so the zoning incentives is another one we're changing those references. There's only 1 or 2 instances where the incentive will actually change. And so we'll point those out as we go through the process, and then so on down. And then finally, we're gonna have a new zoning map. And this is what it would look like with these zones. I didn't provide one that had all of these 26 existing districts, but each one of these more bold colors, or vivid colors, I should say, represents all of those 26 zoning districts that are changing. I wanted to bring up a couple of things that are kind of sticky points that we're working on, just so you're aware of them. One is in these small scale, mostly intermixed into our neighborhood zoning districts. They're listed here, so I don't need to get into it, but some of these zones don't allow a lot of residential uses unless it's part of a mixed use, and that's to prevent commercial displacement. We have limited areas where we have businesses within neighborhoods that people can walk to. And so we want to make sure that we're minimizing that impact. While some of these other zones actually have a lot of properties that are that are actually residential right now. So like the RB zone is really the one that throws a lot of loop into this, but so we're working on trying to figure out a way that if it's currently residential in nature, it can stay that. It can change to being 100% residential of other types of housing, but it's those properties that are now commercial that we want to make sure they maintain some mixed use component. So if they are redeveloped, there's at least some commercial activity in the neighborhoods. The land use tables are also a wild ride as part of this, as Kelsey could point out, but the one thing that we have found, and you heard a little bit about this with the State Street zoning, is there's little consistency between similar zones. Sometimes retail is allowed, sometimes it's not, and it's a mixed use zone. And so this, over the years, we've been trying to fix those things, so we've identified them, but this becomes more of a comprehensive fix. We also want to narrow some of our uses. We have 18 different types of retail uses in our code. We don't think we need that anymore. So we're looking at those types of things. And then we're clarifying and a lot of the qualifying provisions and that are in the footnotes of all the tables. Design standards is another big section. We're trying to clean up a lot of the confusing standards, reducing duplication, and then balancing out those situations where some districts that don't currently have design standards will be getting them. And so that's a new type of regulation for some of these areas. Parking is the most complex of all of this because of the way the parking contexts work. And so we're working on a couple of different scenarios to minimize the impact that this might have. So for example, we don't want to see a zone that currently only requires maybe 1 parking stall for residential type of use because of its proximity to transit or being in a business district to see that increase. But at the same time, if we're in an area where there's not a lot of transportation options, we don't necessarily want to see that parking decrease. And so balancing that out, we think we have found a solution that we'll be bringing back to you as this goes through the process. So wanted to touch on the resources. One of the big important things here is that there's no specific budget allocation for this project. So we're able to do this within our existing budget. It'll be split over 2 budget years. So we're on the fiscal year. So we're wrapping up, we're in the tail end of the current budget year, and then July 1st, we start a new one. So some of these costs we can incur this year with year-end savings. Next year, we start over and we can incur those others. But some of the other resources are really time, and it's not just staff time in our planning office, but every single department reviews our zoning text changes. We rely heavily on some of those departments and divisions, specifically the attorney's office, who ultimately has to approve everything to the right form and everything else. And this is going to be a big text amendment. But it's also decision makers, the council, the commission, the Landmarks Commission, who may have some role here, and then the community as well. And so we want to be cognizant of how the demands we ask of people's time to make it as effective as possible. Our timeline is really aggressive. We're going to wrap up finishing these drafts probably this week. There might be a few that linger into May. We're going to spend the month of May coming up with our engagement plan. We're going to do the engagement over the summer, and we're going to ask for a recommendation sometime in the fall. So we plan on having regular updates and check-ins and reviews with the Planning Commission. I think it's safe to say that you will have various sections. We don't want to try to eat the entire elephant at once. So we'll take some different bites and bring things in, and we'll try to stage that in a way that makes sense, and so that you're up to date, you're up to speed. The community we can pull the meetings, especially when they're briefings and presentations, so the community can see and hear what you're saying, what we're presenting, and there's different ways for people to be up to date. So here's the risks that challenge our timeline mainly. Obviously, if our workload increases, we are still experiencing a decline, so we don't think we've bottomed out yet, and so that might be a risk that comes up in the summertime. Obviously, agenda length. Normally, I wouldn't say normally, but the last 3 or 4 years, we've had typically right around 100 pending applications that have to come to the Planning Commission at any one time. That doesn't mean they're all ready. That means they're in our system. That's down below 50 right now. And so if that's good, as you'll see on tonight's agenda, you'll see it on your next meeting agenda too, which we might bring something related to this project on that agenda as well. And then public engagement activities, producing everything we need to help the public understand what we're doing, and setting a stage to collaborate with the public and the community on the changes, and getting something to where the externalities, the negatives are reduced before we come through. And that relates to the level of controversy. We don't actually think this is going to be all that controversial once we can get in front of people and explain it. We have a bunch of other code changes that are in progress. So we actually have a master sheet that has everything listed on every code section. So every time the council adopts something or gets into the process, our drafts change to reflect that, so that we're always using the most current version of our code. That's way more challenging than it might sound, especially because we don't know when the council is going to schedule things. We don't know what's going to change in the process, but we keep our eye on that. We also don't know when someone's going to leave our staff, right? And so that's a risk that we have all the time. And so sometimes that means, especially if it's a key person working on a project or portion of this project, it may take some time to bring a new person up to speed so they can pick it up. And then noticing costs. So state code changed a couple years ago where we now, for all zoning amendments, whether text or maps, we not only do we have to notice public hearings, we have to notice public meetings as well. And so that the more public meetings we have on this, that includes us briefing you once we have the actual proposal initiated. That's a new cost to the city. And it's important because we are looking at thousands of properties, and each one of those property owners and tenants under our code gets a notice of each one of those. So we're gonna try to pre-schedule some of those things so we can do one notice and satisfy that. As far as our next steps, we've transmitted a summary, this presentation in more of a document format to the city council, because we want to involve them early so they know what's going on. They can give us direction, just like we're doing here. We're going to finalize our engagement plans. We're going to start the noticing costs and figuring all that stuff out. We're going to schedule our work sessions with you, and then start building all of the justification for what we're doing. So that was the last slide. And I'm happy to take any comments, questions, input that you may have.
I wonder, why isn't there an MU 4 and 7 and 9 and 10? Are those for future use, or did they?
They could be. The biggest reason is that our current zone, so some of it's related to actual realities of building height, right? And so the number relates to the stories.
Oh.
So,
Okay.
so the 2, the 3, but when you get down to the MU3 is a 35-foot height. And so one of the reasons why we didn't do a 4 is because at 45 feet, we have so many districts that already allow 50 feet that we're just like, is there really a need to have a special zone for buildings 4 stories in height? Or is that an acceptable way to do it?
I didn't know those were stories, so, okay.
Yeah, I should have stated that.
Are noticing costs just like you have to mail something to everybody?
It's everything from mailing, we have to buy the materials, right? We have postcards that we mail out, all of those types of things. But yeah, it's everything from the ink in the printer to the stamp that gets put on the thing that gets sent out.
Are there any accommodations for electronic noticing? Or is everything required to be mailed right now? Is it a state law, driven by the state law?
Yeah, the city code requires it for map amendments to send all, and so does state code, all property owners impacted by a map amendment needs to get a notice. And that change 2 years ago added basically text changes to very similarly to that.
In going to the zones like named out like that, based on levels, are they still going to have the same actual height requirements, or is it just number of levels? Because that's actually something we talked about.
There is still a height limit, but they're adjusted a little bit to make sure that they accommodate those stories. So you saw this with like the MU8 zone. That height limit's actually 90 feet, not 80, to address taller ground floor heights and things like that. And so same with like the MU11. A lot of those zones, the height ranges from 105 on the low end to 125. So it's going up to that. That's a perfect example of where we don't want to negatively impact somebody's property rights. And so instead, those 105-foot zones will get up to that 125.
Okay.
To Brian, to Mr. Scott's point, we had discussed and had sort of thought, one of the things that we were thinking is that actually having higher floor to floors is a good thing. And so what would be the reason why we couldn't just say, I mean, obviously we have to define it, blah, 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 and what's the level and all that, why we couldn't just say 6 floors and let it be?
That
Instead of having a height, I mean, because that way you could have a 20-foot high ceiling like this one on your ground floor or anywhere else you wanted it, and everybody likes a high ceiling. everybody.
Yeah, and that certainly is an option. And as we go through the process, that isn't a significant change. We're happy to include something that can show what that might look like and for each of those.
The only reason I say that is because the way it is now, people are trying to squeeze as many floors as they can in 90 feet. And so the floor-to-floor height can, be minimal. And that is no way to live.
I can just jump in and add to that comment. I know we used to regulate many of our districts by stories, and we got away from that because it was difficult to administer. I think people would try to argue, what does it count as a story? Is it not a story? And so we went straight to a dimensional limitation, and it's much clearer to administer.
But we're happy to provide some alternatives so you can see what those look like and the pros
No,
and cons.
I understand that it might, but I think we know that people are going to game the system, so we figure out a way to get around that.
Yeah.
I think that's basically, the answer to that question.
So you asked what kind of outcomes we want. There's a few I have written down. One of the outcomes that I'm really interested in seeing is, but I don't know if the zones that this is happening in are in your review, is the inconsistency of how we're allowing buildings with street frontage to not have any nice entrance. And there's a couple examples I gave at a recent meeting. So I'm really interested in that we get some consistency so we don't have zones that when I say, like, how did we do this? And it's like, well, the zone doesn't require it. I mean, Highland Drive.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue for why. So this proposal will plan on using the same kind of type of form-based code that we've done in the FBUN2, so it's building type based. So one of the problems we're having is in the CC zone is that even though residential is allowed, it's all commercial standard. And so it doesn't really work for a lot of those types of housing that you pointed out, whether they're the townhomes or not. And so this will include certain standards based on the type of building it is. And so there will be those, and we have all seen those townhomes that, even if they're sideways oriented, have really good street facing units.
Oh, they can do it.
Yeah, and so
But they
this
also
is
cannot do
a good example of capitalizing on the things that work and applying them more broadly.
Yeah, because if we're doing this review, I'd like to try to make sure that that outcome has some consistency when we have some residential use, that it actually isn't, I'm going to have the side of a building and maybe I got a little window. And that's allowed in the zone.
Yeah.
One of the other frustrations that I've always had, even prior to being on the Planning Commission, is how we handle future land use maps. So it seems that future land use maps have always just been some sort of codification of the status quo and not really a vision of what we want to see in the future. And so, I mean, I've always tried to articulate that the future land use map should be a vision of how we want things to change. But then I also think that conflicts with one of your goals of minimizing creating non-conforming uses. And so how do we like balance actual future land use map visions to then not be creating increased non-conforming uses?
Yeah, so there's two parts there. The first is that a future land use map, because it's not regulatory, doesn't create any nonconformities. It is intended to set the goals and vision and needs for the city in the future.
Yeah, oh,
And
you're right.
so-
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and so that part really isn't a concern. But what I'm going to say about our future land use maps, one, that's the 2025 goal, is to redo all of the future land use maps and build consistency amongst those. Right now, we have 11, I think, community plans and a number of, dozens of small area plans. There is no consistency between the future land use designations in all those plans. So one of the things that and one reason why that's a growing problem is with our water conservation forecasting, because we can't forecast growth. It's much more challenging to do that when we have so many different variables. And so part of that project that we're going to do, that we have to get done by the end of 2025, will be establishing those common future land use designations and descriptions, and then applying them with the lens towards our long-term water needs.
Okay, well, good. We'll have a lot of discussions about future land use
There's gonna be a
because
lot.
I've had a lot of problems with them forever.
Yes.
And then one of my last questions, because I had a bunch, but you answered them in the rest of your presentation. And the zone that I'm most familiar with, where I think this comes up as a question, is the Sugar House Business District 2, when you lump that in with whatever else you did. Because like that specific zone, it does abut residential. It's a pretty drastic difference. Is the new proposed an MU6 going to be providing some sort of transition language?
Yes.
Because I don't know if all of those zones abut residential. They may or may not, but
Right, and everyone that will abut a lower scale residential will have something there. So one of our goals related to the future land use maps is to identify when it's necessary to have certain transitions and when it's not. What's an acceptable scale of change? So if you go from 2 to 3 stories, how much change do you really need to account for? Maybe not much, but if you're going from 2 to 5 or 6, that's a different story. And so we are including different provisions. In fact, most of the focus for buffer yards and setback yards and how they apply is based on what they're next to, not necessarily if they're in the same zone and someone could do something. We're not as concerned about that. We're concerned where there is that transition and change in scale.
so in the Sugar House master plan, there are specific zones that where it does verbally say this is a transition zone. I don't know if every master plan uses that language. So when you do your review, are then you looking at each community master plan to address where they do have language that talks about those types of things?
That will be part of when I mentioned we're going to put together the justification for all the changes. That will be part of that, is reviewing those community plans and pulling out the policies, identifying some place where there may be a gap. But that's part of the intent, is to identify those locations. Where it's really important is when we're considering future zoning changes. So that those types of things, if somebody comes in and they're proposing something, say they pick this MU11 zone and it's right next to an MU2 zone, well, maybe MU11 isn't the right zone next to that, but maybe it's okay to have an MU5 there, and that builds a transition up to that. So that also leads back to how we plan our city in the future, and what is that incremental change that we need over time to address those things, but also allow us to provide the basic needs that we all have and future generations will have.
Yeah, I think that's good. So yeah, I think one of my outcomes are really going to be based on some of the things that we've been seeing a lot of. We talked about how we deal with residential street frontage, but then building length, that we remain consistent like we are now, but we don't change that, so that we don't see massive length buildings, because we get a lot that they want to exceed it. And so I would like to see that we make sure we address that consistently, like keep the consistency we have now in the future MU zones.
Yep.
Okay, that's all I have.
I just want to say thank you because I think it's really wonderful that you're doing this work, and that it's super important to have this simplification. It helps us. I'm sure it helps you. I'm sure it helps applicants. sure it's going to help real estate development in the city. It's also going to help the protection of our environment. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other question the transition thing made me think of is there, now that TSA centers and transition zones are being kind of split, is there any, I feel like part of the idea of those is to kind of create these central nodes that have some kind of distinguishing features throughout them, right? So it's like, this is the ballpark area, and as it spreads out, the design standards are at least somewhat similar. Is there any way to kind of keep that idea of place and that the TSA zones kind of spread when you're separating things out like that? Does that make sense?
Well, I think if I'm following your question correctly, so that type of transition that exists in the TSA zone will continue based on the different scale of zone, right? That's why we're not just making everything that's TSA all one thing regardless.
Yeah.
So, and then the other idea is that the design standards will vary based on the zone. So for example, the low scale zones don't really, one thing we're finding is they don't need as many design standards as big, huge buildings do. Because they're just inherently more human scale, for lack of a better description. But I think you know what I'm talking about there. So one thing, for example, that we are adding to those zones are like maximum lot widths. So people can't come in and combine 3 or 4 lots, scrape what's there, and then build a big, huge building. And so that would be one of those things that if somebody wanted to try that, they'd be going through whatever process we have to modify that with the Planning Commission. If we decide to still allow that modification, it may be something that you don't want to allow anymore.
So do we think that some of the variety in zones now is due to this idea that different places have different characters, like Sugar House is different from, North Temple or something like that? So
Yeah,
there's an idea of that.
There's definitely some truth to that, and that's one of the things that we're struggling with. And it may be that, I mentioned we're eliminating some overlay zones. One way to address that is to have more specific regulations in an overlay, which is how, for example, the city of Portland does it, right? So they have their base zoning, and then certain districts will have an overlay that addresses those unique features. And so that might be something that is a long-term solution to some of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of what I was getting at, is that it might then make sense to add back in overlay zones to, whether it's material or, add certain design elements to
most of our most of our overlay zones right now are use-based, and we don't really think that a lot of them are need to serve that purpose anymore.
Yeah, and they're spread out over, like the South State Street one, spread out over huge amounts of area. So I think that there is something to that kind of sense of place, and so I was just there. It would be good to have something to try and keep that and make sure they feel unified. So.
Well, thanks. I am looking forward to seeing all of this. And with that, we have exhausted our agenda, so we will go ahead and close the meeting.